Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello to all our alumni, staff, students, and everybody else who's joined in for this third UNSW from Home conversation. I'm Professor Claire Annesley. I'm Dean of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today to our conversation on the topic of growing up digitally, a guide for parents. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that are the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you today. And I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, wherever we may be across the country, and I pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So the plan today is to have a conversation. It's a unique offering from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at a really crucial time in global history. It's a time where really critical questions need to be asked, and our approach to interdisciplinary thinking is going to help us articulate our thoughts and our feelings as we navigate considerable levels of uncertainty. I think it's fair to say, and I speak for all the parents participating in this conversation today, that we've got there's a lot of important questions about digital learning. And Dr. Amy Graham is going to cover a really timely and important consideration when it comes to children's education in this current climate and as we move into the future, the new normal, whatever that's going to be. And so hopefully what we're going to be able to do today is provide some clarity and, most importantly, enjoyment for you all. This afternoon, we're going to encourage active audience participation, and you will be able to pose questions in the Microsoft chat function, so please do get involved. The questions are going to be moderated, and Amy and I will get to as many of these as possible. Our conversation will be recorded, and we're going to make this public after this session. Thank you to all of those of you who have joined us. If you do need to leave early, don't worry, the link is going to be emailed to everybody who registered today, so you will receive that in your inbox in the next few days. So let's move on to the topic for the day. I am really delighted to introduce to you Dr. Amy Graham. Amy is a really experienced mixed methods researcher in education, and she's researched widely in the areas of children's use of digital media and the use of technology in distance education, perfectionism, parental engagement, school readiness, and play in the school day. Across all her research, what she strives to do is have a socially just focus, and she believes that everyone must play a role in ensuring that children reach their full potential in education. Since July, Amy's been working at UNSW's Gonski Institute for Education as a research fellow, and enjoys seeing the research that she's been doing being translated into solutions for educators, policy architects, and very importantly, parents. So Amy, welcome. It's great to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Maybe before we start, I think, as I said in my introduction, I'm a parent of two young children who've been battling with all of the challenges of homeschooling and generally digital, and getting the children to go back to school. And I understand you're a parent as well.
I am. I am a parent of three children myself, so I'm living and breathing what I'm talking about today. And I just hats off to all parents for getting past the last few months. And I feel like my worlds are colliding today with my parenting for real, my parent engagement PhD, and my digital learning work now. So thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's great. So let's get going with today's first question for our conversation. I think what's been really interesting in the last 3 months is that parents have had a different role in their children's education, and a different role in their children's development. So, we know that both parents and educators play a really essential role in children's development. What do you think should be the role that parents play, specifically parents play, in their children's education? I think in the last few months, parents have been quite involved in homeschooling and supporting their children. But how involved do parents need to be?
I think parents are integral in a child's education. We've known for a while that parents are a child's first, but also forever teacher, and that role doesn't stop when they arrive at school. It's a lifelong partnership with teachers. And I think parents can enact their engagement in different ways so they can have really positive beliefs about school and communicate that learning really matters. They can also do things in the home that maybe aren't as formal. You know, it's not about doing the jolly phonics or spending hours on homework, but perhaps they can have conversations about things that are happening in society. Certainly, there's no more cogent time than now to do that. So I think they can enact it in their beliefs and their behaviours that education matters. There's a distinction in the literature between involvement and engagement, and it is really a continuum. So we can see it almost on a line. So the involvement is the school-led, more passive types of involvement, like helping in the canteen. And then we go right through to engagement, where it is communicating through your expectations and your beliefs that learning matters, setting up an educationally stimulating environment, lots of toys, lots of opportunities to play, socialisation with others, things like that. But I'm a big believer that there's no such thing as an over-engaged parent. You can simply never be too engaged in your child's learning.
And do you think it matters how parents talk about school or going to school and the school environment?
Yeah, so this partnership with teachers is a critical one. So it starts in the home. It starts before they arrive at school, making sure that children know that school's a great place to be. So projecting that confidence in a child's teacher, showing respect for the profession that is education and teaching. And I think when I said you can't have an over-engaged parent, you could have an over-involved parent. So we could see that parents get a little bit too interested in the mechanics of the school day and not so focused on the things that you can do within the home to promote that learning is important. And we can see on screen that there's a whole range of benefits from being engaged in a child's learning, and that goes right through from a better readiness for school, which my PhD research looked in, right through to better, and more improved educational, social and emotional outcomes, right through to after-school pathways. So parenting is difficult, we know that, but if we go into that school day positively with confidence that their teachers are doing an excellent job, then I think we're in a much better position to try and establish that positive relationship.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I guess that it's hard for parents to do if their experiences of school themselves weren't particularly positive. So that's what would you say about that?
Yeah, there's a whole range of factors that make it more difficult for parents to engage. So if they didn't have positive school experiences themselves, or they're fearful of the school, or the only time they're called in is when there's a problem, then their relationship can be quite skewed. But if we look, even from a school perspective, if we look for opportunities to share the good news with parents about their children, recognise their role as the person that knows their child best, and that goes a long way to overcoming those sorts of factors that put them behind. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the work that you've been doing in the Gonski Institute for Education here at UNSW. And the Institute recently published Growing Up Digital report. And I think this is a really groundbreaking research project, which is, it's really there to try to help us understand how much technology is impacting children in Australia, particularly as the use of technology becomes greater and more widespread. So can we spend a few minutes unpacking that Growing Up Digital report? What did what did you do? What did you do with that particular research project?
Yes, so when I came on board at the Gonski Institute for Education in July, one of my first projects was getting this Growing Up Digital Australia happening. So it was a study that originated back in Alberta, Canada, a few years ago, where they developed an instrument to look at two aspects that were important. One is the changes to children's wellbeing over the last 3 to 5 years, and also the changing use of digital media. And we're careful there to make sure that we're clear that we're looking for relationships. We're not looking for to create a causal link or to suggest that one thing causes another, but we're looking at the changes through teachers and school principals and administrative staff, what they're seeing in their classrooms in these two areas. So we interviewed and surveyed over 1,800, almost 1,900 educators in Australia last year. So this was the pre-COVID period. So it provided a really interesting snapshot into what's happening in Australian classrooms beforehand.
And go on then, what did you find? And what are the impacts of your findings for parents?
Yeah, so I think, part of the initial goal was to be able to contribute meaningfully to this debate about what the impact is of digital technologies on wellbeing. And so I think the number one takeaway is that classrooms are complex now. So we're not looking at children that perhaps had the same childhoods that you or I did. So I think it's important to note here that over 90% of educators noticed declining social, emotional and psychological well-being. So they noticed increases in the challenges there. So that makes classrooms difficult to teach in now. Students are using devices prolifically and in some of them in really problematic ways, which lead to declining well-being, declining readiness to learn, less physical activity, more tiredness, coming to school hungry, not focusing on educational tasks. So that makes the work of teachers and also parents a little bit harder. We can see when we are, as parents, we can see when our children aren't ready to learn or ready to engage with what we're asking them to do. If they're tired, they're more difficult to bring along to do a job. So I think for teachers that are dealing with this all day, we need to listen to what they've found. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, and we were careful to report both the positives and the negatives. And I think a lot of the rhetoric in this area is focusing on one or the other, and we were quite careful to make sure that we presented that balanced perspective. So educational potential of digital media and technology is excellent. Teachers were doing fantastic things to try and engage children in learning, and for certain students these made learning opportunities even more present than it would have been, doing traditional forms. But it needs to be seen as a tool and nothing more or nothing less, but just as a learning tool.
Okay. I think, that's really, really interesting. I think it's one of the things that all parents sort of grapple with is how to manage the benefits of technology, the good side of it, the benefits that these tools can bring, but also at the same time mitigating those negative impacts. So how do parents do that, or what role can parents play in helping children balance that and get it right for when they go into school as well?
Yes, I think you're right. I think acknowledging that technology is here to stay, and we've seen that recently with the move rapidly to online learning. So I think acknowledging that it's here to stay and not trying to, do anything like banning is an important first step. So we need to teach wise and ethical and responsible use of devices. I think there's a responsibility of researchers to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers. So there's so much that we don't know in this area yet. We don't understand the causal link. We don't understand whether social media causes depression or whether people with depression use social media more often. So I think there's a lot that we don't know. So I think, hold fire on the big claims of, screen time ruins brains and things like that. Parents just don't need that guilt. And I think it's so hard for parents to get clear advice now. One day you'll read a headline talking about really big claims on the risks of screen time, and then others you'll hear that screen time is no more harmful than eating a potato. So I think that we have a huge amount of learning to do and listening to young people and parents themselves about their concerns. So I think in our research, we've established that there is links between lower readiness to learn and declining wellbeing and increased uses of devices in distracting ways. So I think if we see it as that learning tool, that's the best way that we're going to be able to mitigate those risks, if we try to teach that balanced perspective.
I think that's really interesting, that notion of a balanced perspective. And, it makes me think that, as parents, we start to kind of think about how we can, manage our children's consumption of digital technology. And what would be your advice about how parents can best support their children with that?
Yeah, so I think parents can start by opening up the conversation and having that two-way communication, like we talked about with schools. So if they are using the technology at school, having a conversation with the school, but also their child. So there's a lot of principles which maybe we could discuss later, some more principles of ways to do it. But at the moment, I want to talk about a digital diet. Now, this is a term that's gaining popularity in the US and now in Australia. And it's based on this idea of, when we talk about a healthy diet or healthy food, we don't talk about food time. So we don't talk about how much time you spent eating food. We talk about the components of what goes into a healthy diet. So we talk about content and quality, not just quantity. So I think if we apply the similar logic as parents when we're trying to work with our children on designing this diet, we would talk about quality and quantity. So we would talk beyond the minutage. We would talk beyond the current guidelines, which actually only talk about minutage, so time-based guidelines that increase with a child's age. They were designed before the mobilisation of screen-based technology, so before every child had access to a handheld screen-based device, and I think they need modernising. So I think if we look back to that food example, in the pyramid you have different food groups, and in explaining those food groups, you would talk about energy intake and output, different components of a diet, so carbohydrates and fats. And I think there's a role to do that with digital technologies as well. Bearing in mind how much conflicting advice is there for parents, all of my advice sort of surrounds this point of, there is a place for screens, but it shouldn't come at the expense of play or physical activity or spending time with people in real time. So when I give these sort of tips, I'm very much aware of screens need to be a part of a child's life, particularly at the moment for learning. But if we can try to introduce other aspects, we could look at what would happen to a child's day. So there is a place for restricting use sometimes. So we could think of, if they're on a screen, what else might they be doing if they're off it? So might they be playing outside, or might they be reading a book, or might they be cooking a meal with a parent or having a conversation with a parent? So there's certainly a place for restriction, absolute place for monitoring. So the number one protective factor you can do to protect your child is to monitor what they're doing online. They are less likely to get into precarious situations or look up inappropriate content or misconstrue a comment which could lead to bullying if they're doing it in a public place with the knowledge that their parents will check up on them and know everything that they're doing. So, I mean, my no-go zones would be bedrooms and dinner tables. There's just no need for those two things. Like I said, not all screen time is created equal. So in establishing our expectations, we do need to be aware that an hour of YouTube is not the same as an hour of coding a robot. So I think there's a place to embrace that educational purpose and teach kids purposeful use. So if you feel like you need to use a screen because you need to do your work or you're on a long car trip or whatever, there's opportunities to teach the creation of content. You know, photos on a holiday, on a long car trip, create a pic collage, do an online art class together, learn together is a great one. Also, don't glamorize or incentivize the use of screens. So often, particularly in the early years, screens can be used as a bit of a digital babysitter, and I'm sure we've all done it, but it's, as much as possible, try to teach that purposeful use. Try to teach them that they are a tool, but there are many others available to them. So we're not doing it as a reward or as an incentive to raise their status above any other, like a But the last one is the elephant in the room. If I hate to be the one to say it, but I think we do need to accept that parent role modelling is huge here. So it is, you know, it's a difficult one to talk about and to confront, but if we are sitting on our phones, checking emails or Instagram or whatever it is that we're doing in front of our children, it is much more difficult to reinforce those habits that you're trying to establish and reinforce for your child. So I think as much as possible, try to remember that you are the ultimate role model for your child. And there's some critics that say, and some experts that say, that digital distraction by parents is probably more damaging than for children themselves.
Yeah, Amy, this is so interesting, and I really like that concept of the digital diet, because and that metaphor, or you know, that comparison to food and how we approach food and eating, and how those guidelines about food have changed as well. You know, these are things that we have to keep readjusting. And I also really like the idea that, you know, just like with food, we don't talk about consumption, you know, what you should eat or what you shouldn't eat, but that it's a balance, that if you do eat that, then you have to go outside and do exercise, or you have to compensate. And I think that's, so instinctively, that feels like a really useful tool for parents. It'd be really interesting to see what people who are listening think as well. I've got another question, which is about, you know, as we're moving back into lockdown and restrictions being eased across the country, how are we best going to manage our children's transition back into school? Do you kind of foresee any problems between moving back from that remote learning, where children have been at home and learning online mostly, back to face-to-face teaching?
I think certainly one of the biggest concerns for parents that I've spoken to has been that digital snapback. So a bit of concern about perhaps they've used screens a little bit more or differently to how they might usually. And you might be feeling quite concerned at the moment that you've caused some sort of irreparable damage. And really all I want to do is reassure you that I'm sure you have not. This isn't forever, and we as parents have had a hard time, and so have our children. So I think most of them have probably embraced it for a little while, but knowing that they are still missing the connection with their friends. And certainly most of the children that I've spoken to, and certainly my own, have really been excited by going back to school and re-establishing those connections. We all recognise that teaching and learning is a human endeavour, and we need that connection with people. So I think, just anecdotally, most children have actually not been that interested in being on their screens for entertainment purposes so much anymore, because they've done so much learning on it. And we know from other research that online learning does create a lot more tiredness. So I know some schools were very smart about this and reduced the lesson time down a little bit, being aware of that cognitive load. But as parents and as schools, we might see some behaviour changes. So we might see some of the flow-on effects of that tiredness. And so I think what we can do is to recalibrate our expectations and not try and play catch up on the learning and not be too panicked about what we're seeing now. So I think if we can try and, refocus and get back on track. And on that, I think part of it is acknowledging the digital divide. So some of the children that have been forced into this model weren't equipped to do so. They might be have intermittent internet access, or they might be in a stressful or traumatic environment, and they also might have poverty or English as a second language, other areas of disadvantage that makes it a little bit harder to learn in an online environment. So I think as schools and parents, we need to be aware that we can give them a little bit more of what they need when they come back to school. Do it slowly.
Oh, Amy, I have so many questions that I'd like to ask you, but what I want to make sure that we do is move on to some of the questions that were submitted ahead of this event. Is that okay if we do that? Yeah.
Sure.
So we have a question from a lady called Jane, and I'm guessing she's a parent. She says, "What can I do about screen time if my child needs to do schoolwork online?"
It's such an important issue. So thank you for the question. I think it comes down to that content over or quantity over quality, or quality versus quantity argument again. So I think we can't automatically assume that because they have had screen time at school or need to do their homework online, that's in the same, to be considered in the same way. So I don't think we need to worry so much about that. But I also think there's a role, depending on the age of the child. It's a lot more hard in secondary school to keep up. But if you consider other ways, if the homework really needs to be done on screens, so are there alternative ways that you could introduce the same content at home in a play-based way? Is there room for a conversation with your child's school about thinking outside the box a little bit, having a little bit more of an informed perspective after this time, that the technology was there to get us through the remote learning, and it did a brilliant job. I mean, by all accounts, the actual technological difficulties were pretty good compared to what they could have been when we all moved pretty rapidly. So I think we need to be informed enough ourselves to be able to advocate for an approach with your child's school. Also think keep the same principles that you have at home. So if you have your family media plan and you've established those expectations like we talked earlier, your child will be doing it in a communal area. They will be checking in with you. They will be opening you up into the conversation, and they're all really protective factors. So it's not about the time, it's about what they're doing on it and how you're supporting them through that.
Yeah, that's really, really, really cool. I've got a question from Nicole. This is quite a long question, so just bear with me. So Nicole asks that she says that she's noticed during homeschooling how impatient her children are with technology, and the alarming tendency for them to bash keys in frustration rather than slow down and read what's before them to solve an issue. So we're in this kind of bite-sized information era, and our kids want everything to happen yesterday, she says. Her concern is that her children are completely unaware of this change in behaviour in this technological generation. And so they're not able to regulate themselves accordingly. So her question ultimately is whether, if at all, parents can address this.
Great question, thank you. So firstly, this is interesting because this actually came through from the educators as well. So many of our educators in the open-ended questions, when they were asked further about their concerns, they were concerned about this need for instant gratification for students. So students needed everything yesterday, like you said, or they weren't wanting to engage in a task like complicated maths problems or handwriting if it wasn't presented on a screen. And yet teachers also commented that the skill level of students in terms of synthesising and researching, analysing information online was pretty poor. So they could gain to their heart's content, but they weren't actually able to distinguish between the real and fake news, which admittedly many adults also struggle with. So unsurprising there, but it's interesting. So you're not alone. I think acknowledging that children don't have those capacities. So we as parents do need to intervene there. So we do need to set up that scaffolding and those monitoring strategies so that we're teaching them to slow it down. We're giving them regular breaks. We're encouraging them in a non-alarmist way, but to be aware of the risks or the permanence of what you put online. So we do need to teach those mindful strategies, and they're not going to come naturally. What will come naturally is, you know, if there aren't any effective habits in place, children will likely need to be wound back off those. So I think getting it early as much as possible is great. So if you're a parent of an early childhood sort of age child, great. If you are in a position where you've already got into the need for instant gratification and you're noticing some alarming things, really try to open up that conversation and come into their world.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's great advice. So the next question, this is a question that was submitted ahead of today as well, comes from Elisa, who's a languages and linguistics academic with us at UNSW, and she asks, I'm interested to know how I, as a parent who grew up without digital technology, can help my children make a better connection with this technology.
Yeah, it's hard. You know, we do accept now that children have grown up differently to how we did. So I think recognising that is the first step. Children are now today's children are the digital natives, and we really are the visitors in their land. Now that gives us a great opportunity to have those conversations and to learn from them. And reciprocally, it also helps children to really feel like you value what they're doing. So rather than being the one that's stopping them from doing something, learn from them, ask them questions, sit with them. Once again, it's a great protective factor to have a parent watch something with you that's age appropriate, that's not aggressive or violent, and then having a conversation afterwards about your thoughts and what you gained from watching that. So I think there's great opportunities. So yes, you know, obviously we need to know a little bit about being a bit tech savvy. We need to know some things about the risks, but we don't need to be an expert in every app. And simply having an open relationship with your child is going to do far better than upskilling on the app.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I know there was a real shift in my head at one point where I decided that I was, instead of saying to my children, I don't want to know about Fortnite, I don't want to know about Fortnite, I started asking questions and entering that world. And actually it was a really a really good thing to do. So we've got a question from Danielle. Hi Danielle, who's listening into our conversation. And her question is, how do I give my 9-year-old daughter some privacy to message openly with her friends, but also keep an eye on her conversation for appropriateness and kindness as she's navigating these online relationships for the first time?
Thank you, Danielle. So I think that it comes back to that monitoring firstly. So if you are using it, if your child is using it in a communal area, which any 9-year-old really should be, if we're honest, we can supervise and we can open that conversation. So establish some boundaries around who she chats to, where. she does it, what she shares, and how to behave in a group chat, and when it's okay to exit those things. So I think there's great resources online, and the E-Safety Commissioner particularly is an excellent Australian resource that helps parents along that. But don't wait until there's a problem to start these conversations. Don't let it be that slippery slope. I think it's difficult sometimes to do it all, but if we can have those boundaries set up that she's doing it right next to you, and you've got the relationship where you can be open, then you're in a much better position to set that up safely for her. And also, these guidelines and limits that you set shouldn't be static. So they change and develop as your child's relationship with digital media and their friends develops. So a good one for 9 years old is, I would introduce, and I also have a 9-year-old, I would also introduce the age restrictions. So an awareness of the laws. You aren't allowed on social media like Snapchat or Facebook or anything like that under the age of 13. So I think an awareness of the laws, but certainly in terms of messaging friends, there's great benefits to staying connected in that way, as we've just seen. But I think being aware that you will be checking in and having those conversations about how to do it safely.
And how do we help our children navigate that balance between the law and, you know, what everybody else at school or in their peer group is doing?
It's such a tricky one. The peers for young people are probably more influential than parents. So once again, if you have set it up early that you expect to have a conversation with your child daily about what they're doing online, sitting with them, peering over their shoulder, being present when they're on the phone, watching what they're watching, playing the game with them, those sorts of things, then you'll be a part of their world rather than someone that's trying to stop them being a part of it.
Yeah. So we got a question from Ben. So Ben asks, are there safe ways to slowly expose preschool age children to the internet? And he asks this because he says he was surprised that his dad, the grandfather of his child, just turned on Google for his 5-year-old son and told him to type words like fish and see what comes up. And he said, that seemed rather risky to me. There's little control over what images constantly come up. So yeah, that's a great question.
It is. Thank you, Ben. I think hats off to your dad, who engaged in purposeful research with your young person. So I think very early on, your dad has been teaching the right skills of using devices for research and as a tool to support learning. I completely get your concerns about safety. And I think, once again, the E-Safety Commissioner has recently released these principles for preschoolers around be safe, be kind, ask for help, and make good choices. And I think they're the principles that you apply with very young children. And they're quite tangible, and they've done a play school episode on it. It was really great, actually. But I think, yeah, your dad's done the right thing by teaching that devices are a learning tool and can help us find information. There are certain monitoring and controls that you can put on, and filters that you can put on the apps, and you can find those online. So I think you can certainly block and filter as you see fit for the age of your child. But I do think there's another side that perhaps is a real benefit, that he's being taught really early to use devices in purposeful ways.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. But there's always the one thing that I would like to ask you is, how do you sometimes I think that parents are really kind of trying to catch up, and we just don't know what's out there. We don't even know what it is that we're dealing with, or what we need to be looking out for, or how to do the technological things that you just suggested, like putting on filters, or or dealing with this very rapidly changing technology. So what do you think are the best sources of information, or upskilling for parents themselves in those kind of areas?
Yes, well, we developed a parent guide at the Gonski Institute for Education on this very issue. So that's one source. But with that, we use the principles that are recommended by the eSafety Commissioner. So they are our best source of information. There's also a US-based body called Common Sense Media that help to give more app-specific advice. So I go to them if, I'm looking if even a book is appropriate for my children that's been turned into a movie. I'll consult them about age-based guidelines, those sorts of things. So there's a plethora of information online. But I think, again, if we come back to those principles of balance, if you have those set up in your home where your children know that devices are there, but they're not it, you've got a whole range of activities that you're engaging in with your child, you've got a really positive value on learning, like we talked about at the beginning, then it won't be the default. It won't be the first thing that they go to. It will be just part of the day.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another live question, which I think is really interesting. Earlier in our conversation, Amy, you were talking about how we don't know what the links are between the use of social media and depression. So we have a question from Grace, which is kind of related to that. And she asks, does excessive use of digital technology become an addiction like gambling? What do we know about that? Is there any evidence out there yet?
Yes, so there is Jean Twenge is a US-based researcher that has some research around iPhones and the iGeneration basically ruining a generation of children. Like I said, I'm a little bit more balanced in the sense that I try not to take a one or the other binary position. I try to be a little bit more balanced in my view and look at the nuanced perspectives. I think with children, what we do know is that digital technology doesn't affect all children equally. Yeah. So and that's what we're particularly interested in at the Gonski Institute. So some children might be able to be online and they've had the right modelling at home and they've had the right guidelines set up. So they're responsible, ethical, kind users that can put it down and get on with their day. But other children are more prone to the negative consequences and can get into really problematic territory. We avoid the use of addiction or any sort of labels like that, more looking at those problematic uses and how it's affecting your family life. I think one thing that we are missing as part of the conversation is where can parents go for help once they have gone on that slippery slope. So I think there's quite a bit around the preemptive setting of guidelines and how to set those as effective limits. But I'd like to see more in the conversation around and less shaming of when your child does have a problem, where can you go for help? So I think certainly it's a maybe for me. I think some children will be more prone to those problematic consequences, and I think they certainly are designed in ways that can make children really attracted to playing them for long periods of time. And I think you'd have a lucky child that would voluntarily get off it without a few reminders. But for the most part, our modelling at home and our guidelines at home is the best protective factor that you can set up.
Yeah. I wonder if there are children who are just not interested in screens and online devices. Is there such a child growing up today, do you think?
I think so. And I think, once again, if you start early, it's just a part of life. It's just like children will see them but not be attracted to them. So if you don't glamorise it and don't treat it any differently, good or bad, then it probably just becomes part of the furniture.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really, really good point. Oh, Amy, it's been such a really rich conversation, and I've learned a lot, and there's lots more that I would love to talk to you about, but we can find another time to carry on the conversation. I think there's everybody who's listening knows to go to the Gonski Institute for Education, where there's more resources that they can find there for parents if they want to find out more about this. And I thoroughly recommend that everybody reads the Growing Up Digital report. So thank you very much for all of your insights today. It's been really fantastic. So on behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and on behalf of everybody who's listening here today, thank you for joining us, sharing your wisdom with us today. These are issues, as you know, as I've talked to you before, as a parent, I'm grappling with on a daily basis, and I think that the whole idea of balance and the digital diet, I think it helps us to have much more nuanced conversations about this. So I found it really useful. Thank you everyone who's tuned in for this live discussion. I hope it's been as interesting for you as it has been for Amy and I today. And I hope you all, like me, leave with some techniques about how to help your children thrive in this online world, this increasingly digital world that we live in. I'd also like to let you know that we've got another conversation in our UNSW from Home conversation series next week. Next Thursday, we're going to be joined by Associate Professor Christy Newman to discuss relationships, specifically in this COVID-19 socially distant context. And you can find details on all of our conversation topics from the past and next week's, and register for those events on the UNSW alumni and giving webpage. As I said at the start of our conversation, this conversation has been recorded, and we're going to share the link with you via email. So everyone who pre-registered for today's event will receive it, and it's also going to be made available on the UNSW alumni website. In the follow-up email, there'll be a short event survey, and we'd really appreciate any feedback that you have on this afternoon's conversation. And I really, really hope you can join us for our next UNSW from Home conversation at 12 o'clock next Thursday, and that's the 4th of June. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.